Hello, it's Scott Manley here with a little bit of it's story time. It's Scott Manley story time. It's space history story time, wherein I attempt to link one of America's favorite and biggest breakfast cereal manufacturers with their unintentional contribution to the Soviet space propaganda machine. A great first for the Soviet Union was in part because of the work done by General Mills, best known for making Cheerios. So yeah, let's go back to the 1950s, about a decade into the Cold War, just as the space programs are really starting to get going. General Mills are actually working with the CIA at this point. They are making very high altitude balloons. Prior to this, balloons were made of rubber, but a new material came along called polyethylene, which was better because it would hold in the gas longer and it would handle better in the higher altitudes. And guess what? If you're a cereal manufacturer, you know all about packaging materials. So making big weather balloons wasn't such a stretch. You actually find this a lot in American history, American industrial history in the 1940s, the post-war years, because, of course, during the war, it was expected that everybody would do their part, and that meant that industries would find out that they were useful, they were able to contribute in some way, which wasn't necessarily their main business. If you look at American industrial history, you'll see that there's a lot of diversification of American companies just after the war, and some fun examples I like to... I mean, if you think that a cereal manufacturer building spy balloons, balloons that fly scientific packages are crazy. Just think that a company best known for making mason jars, right? Jars that you put your pickles in or whatever, Ball, managed to create a subsidiary called Ball Aerospace, which has built some of the most important spacecraft of the last 20, 30 years. We've had IRAS and the WISE, the Wide Field Infrared Survey Explorer. So that's one example, and one I like to point out is if you've ever gone bowling in the US, there's a company called AMF, right? AMF Bowling. They were like an American machine foundry. They built all sorts of heavy equipment. They even built nuclear reactors. And now they're best known for being a bowling alley company. Yeah, it's almost like Fallout, yeah, right? We build nuclear reactors in bowling alleys, right? Anyway, let's rewind. So basically, 1950s, a decade into the Cold War, Russian nuclear program, Soviet nuclear program. America's very interested in this. And there's a few ideas that actually that happen around this. One of the more interesting ones actually is Project Mogul, where a scientist got the idea to fly balloons at a certain altitude in the atmosphere with microphones underneath them. These balloons would be able to detect nuclear explosions happening perhaps on the far side of the Earth. The idea was that if you found the right altitude where the speed of sound was slowest, then the sound would be confined in this channel, rather like it is in the ocean. These balloons were probably best or most notable these days because one of them crashed near a little place called Roswell, New Mexico. And the officer in charge decided to tell the press that no, this wasn't a secret military balloon that was tracking Soviet nuclear experiments. It was, in fact, a crashed alien spaceship. Anyway, the project that I'm really going to talk about is Project Genetrix. So Project Genetrix was kind of a precursor to military spy satellites. The idea was you would fly a balloon with a camera underneath it, and this would get carried up into the jet stream and then fly across the Soviet Union, snapping pictures of all those things that we couldn't see because we didn't have spy planes that would fly high enough or fast enough or safe enough. And as it got to the far side, you would send a coded radio signal. The package would detach with the camera and everything. It would fall down, parachute would open, and then a pilot of a C-119 airplane would come down and grab it out of the air and whisk it off to the CIA, who would do all this amazing analysis to find out what was really going on. So yeah, January 1956, they were launching. They launched about 500 of these. And the problem was they were supposed to be super stealthy, right? They were very careful to minimize the amount of metal. I mean, there were balloons, there were big balloons, but but they didn't have much metal in them. But unfortunately, somebody somewhere made a mistake, and one of the pieces of rigging apparently was a steel rod which was 91 centimeters long, and 91 centimeters was the frequency at which the Soviet radar was working. So pretty much that thing lit up like a Christmas tree, and the Soviets saw all these balloons flying across their country, and they were really mad. The Soviet pilots actually figured out that first thing in the morning they would be low enough that they could get their planes up to the altitude to shoot them down. So in the end, only less than 50 of these cameras actually made it across, and the rest of them ended up in the middle of Soviet farms and things like that. Because so many were getting lost, and because the Soviets were complaining, the program got shut down fairly quickly. And that ended General Mills' association with spy satellites, or, sorry, spy balloons, right? Now, this is all very interesting. The hardware got into Soviet hands. But, you know, Soviets also built amazing camera hardware as well. In fact, they were building an awesome camera for their spacecraft Luna 3. So Luna 3, its plan was to fly out to the moon, swing around the far side, like around the far side of my head, because you've got dark far side of the moon, right? If Earth's over in this direction, you can't see this side, so my left ear is continually hidden from the Earth. So if you fly a spacecraft around like that, it could snap some pictures. And the Soviets built this great spacecraft. It was autonomous. It would use a gravity assist of the moon to swing it into an orbit that would bring it back close to the Earth, so that their ground stations would be able to receive any transmissions it sent. They obviously hadn't developed electronic cameras. They had developed film cameras. And the satellite, or the spacecraft, would take the pictures, develop the film on board, and then when it flew back within transmission range of Earth, it would start transmitting the images down using a photomultiplier, and it would transmit like 1,000-line images. The problem was, despite having a really good camera, cutting-edge space technology, and the ability to talk to these things, and the ability to send a spacecraft on this mission, they realized after Explorer 1 that any film going through the Van Allen belts would probably get fogged and end up useless, right? It would have to handle extremes of temperature that Soviet film was not capable of handling at the time. And it just so happened that one of the individuals that was working on the camera had been sent some samples from this Project Genetrix camera, which was recovered. And he realized that the film in the cameras that the CIA had been sending over Russia had to have been specially hardened to handle the low temperatures and the radiation in the upper atmosphere. And after a bit of testing, they realized that this film would perfectly suit their needs for Luna 3. So they took the film, they cut it to the right size. I believe they were using like standard 35mm with your film, but whereas the CIA was using much bigger plates. They cut it to the right size, and they tested it on their developer hardware, and it all worked. And so, the film that was flown on Luna 3, which took pictures of the far side of the moon for the first time, was supplied by General Mills and designed by the CIA. And also, you know, if we're going to talk about unintentional international collaboration, George Rollbank was, of course, instrumental in verifying that these spacecraft were indeed flying out there, because they had the biggest dish in the West, and in fact in the world at the time. They were one of the few people able to actually keep in contact with the Luna spacecraft as they were really close to the moon. Of course, the Russians eventually got their own gear in question and didn't have to rely on George Rollbank. But yeah, this is one of these like utterly fascinating stories. This is 1950s, the Cold War is in full swing, and yet collaboration accidentally happened. Intentional collaboration on space projects did actually happen later on. I mean, obviously in the 1970s you had Apollo Soyuz, right, where they would get together in space and they did all sorts of cool things. And nowadays, of course, the International Space Station is a fine example of collaboration between the East and the West. But yeah, General Mills helping taking pictures of the far side of the moon. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.